Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Before we start, I need to warn you, what you're about to hear will mess you up. These aren't ghost stories. These are 6 real events from small Appalachian towns where people vanish, neighbors turn into monsters, and entire communities hide deadly secrets. This is the kind of stuff that keeps you up at night. Hit subscribe right now, smash that like button, and share this if you're brave enough. Tell me where you're watching from. Let's begin. I'm 52 years old, and I've been the night janitor at Ridgewood High School for going on 8 years now. It's not glamorous work, but it pays decent and lets me avoid most people, which suits me fine. The school sits right in the heart of Pine Hollow, North Carolina, population 140 on a good day when nobody's visiting family down in Charlotte. We're tucked so far back in these mountains that GPS gives up halfway here, and most folks have never heard of our little town. I grew up about 20 miles east, but moved to Pine Hollow after my divorce when I needed somewhere quiet to think. Bought a small house on Mill Creek Road for next to nothing, and when the janitor position opened up at the school, it felt like everything was falling into place. The job's simple enough. Clean classrooms, empty trash, basic maintenance on a building that's older than I am. About 200 kids from all over these hollers come here, kindergarten through 12th grade, and most nights I have the whole place to myself from 6 p.m. until around midnight. The thing about working alone in a big empty building is you get used to every sound, every creak, every way the wind hits the windows. After 8 years, I knew exactly how the old boiler hummed, which doors squeaked, and where the floorboards groaned when the temperature dropped. I had my routine down to a science. Start with the main hallway, work through the classrooms wing by wing, finish up in the gym and cafeteria. In all that time, I'd maybe had 3 or 4 incidents worth mentioning. A couple kids who snuck back in after hours, a raccoon that somehow got into the kitchen once, and that time someone's car alarm went off in the parking lot and scared me half to death. Point is, Ridgewood High was predictable, and I liked it that way. The school itself serves kids from probably a 50-mile radius, drawing from families scattered across these mountains in places that barely qualify as communities. A lot of these kids ride the bus for over an hour each way, getting picked up before dawn and not getting home until well after dark. Their families have been in these hills for generations. Coal mining families, logging families, people who know every ridge and hollow like their own backyard. The teachers are good folks too, mostly locals who went away to college and came back home to teach. Principal Morrison had been there since before I started, and she knew every student by name and most of their parents too. It was the kind of school where everybody looked out for everybody else, where if a kid didn't show up, someone called home to check. That's why what started happening in November was so unsettling. It went against everything I thought I knew about this place and these people. My wife Linda had left me about 3 years before I took the janitor job. Said I was too quiet, too set in my ways, didn't communicate enough. Maybe she was right. I've always been the type to keep to myself, think things through before speaking. Growing up with 4 older brothers in a house where you had to fight for every word, I learned early that listening was usually smarter than talking. After the divorce, I found I actually preferred the solitude. My little house on Mill Creek had everything I needed. A wood stove, decent well water, enough land for a small garden, and neighbors far enough away that I couldn't see their porch lights. The janitor job was perfect because it let me work when the building was quiet, move at my own pace, and go home to my quiet life without dealing with much human drama. It was the second week of November when I first noticed things weren't quite right. Students had been complaining to the teachers about missing items from their lockers. Nothing valuable. We're talking about clothes mostly, maybe a pair of sneakers, a jacket, sometimes jewelry. At first, Mrs. Patterson in the office figured it was just typical teenage stuff, kids borrowing things and forgetting to return them, or maybe losing track of what they'd brought to school. But by the 3rd week, the complaints were getting more frequent and more specific. Sarah Chen was missing a sweater her grandmother had knitted. Marcus Webb's work boots had disappeared overnight. Katie Morrison, the principal's own niece, couldn't find the silver bracelet her boyfriend had given her for her birthday. What struck me as odd was that the missing items were so random. Different sizes, different styles, belonging to kids from different grades and social circles. It wasn't like someone was targeting popular kids or picking on anyone specific. A freshman's winter coat would go missing the same night as a senior's baseball cap. Sometimes expensive items were left alone while cheaper things disappeared. It didn't make sense as theft, and it definitely didn't make sense as some kind of prank or bullying situation. That's when I started finding the clothes. The first item I discovered was hanging in the boiler room. A girl's cardigan sweater draped over one of the pipes like someone had been warming it. The sweater was stretched out wrong, like it had been forced onto someone much larger than it was meant for. When I brought it to the office the next morning, Jenny Caldwell claimed it immediately. Said it had disappeared from her locker 3 days earlier, but looking at it, I could tell it had been worn recently. There was a smell to it, not exactly unpleasant, but definitely not Jenny's perfume or laundry detergent. Something earthy and unfamiliar. Over the next few nights, I found more items in stranger places. A pair of men's work boots sitting neatly in the middle of the library, too big for any of the high school boys. A woman's scarf wrapped around the flagpole in the main hallway, still warm to the touch even though the building had been empty for hours. Most disturbing was the collection of clothes I discovered in the crawl space above the ceiling tiles in Mrs. Henderson's English classroom. 6 or 7 different items, all wrinkled and stretched like they'd been worn by someone they didn't fit. I started checking the security cameras, but here's where things got really strange. We only had 4 cameras, 1 in each hallway and 1 covering the main entrance. Every time clothes went missing or turned up somewhere weird, those cameras would malfunction. Not all at once, just the one covering the area where something happened. The recording would cut out for anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours, then resume like nothing had happened. When I asked Principal Morrison about getting the system looked at, she said the cameras were old and probably needed replacing, but the school budget wouldn't cover it until next year. That's when I started staying later and paying closer attention. The first thing I noticed was the scratches. Deep gouges in the wooden door frames, like something with very large claws, had been testing the strength of the wood. The marks were too high off the ground to be made by a dog or cat, and too deep to be made by any animal that should have been able to get inside the building. I found similar scratches on the walls in various hallways, always about 7 feet off the ground, always in groups of 4 parallel lines. When I mentioned them to the daytime maintenance crew, they figured kids were using some kind of tool to vandalize the building, but I knew better. These marks were made by something alive. The footsteps started during my 3rd week of paying closer attention. I'd be mopping the floor in one wing of the building and hear someone walking around in another section. Not trying to be quiet, just normal footsteps like a person going about their business. But when I'd go investigate, I'd never find anyone. The hallways would be empty, all the classroom doors locked, just like I'd left them. Sometimes the footsteps would seem to follow my own route, through the building, staying maybe 20 or 30 feet behind me. Other times, I'd hear them in the opposite direction, like someone was deliberately avoiding crossing paths with me. The warm air was probably the most unsettling part. I'd walk into an area where I'd just heard footsteps, and the air would be noticeably warmer than the rest of the building, like someone with a much higher body temperature than normal had been standing there moments before. Not uncomfortably hot, just wrong. And there was always that same earthy smell I'd noticed on the clothes. Not dirty exactly, but organic in a way that didn't belong in a school building. I started finding the chairs, arranged in perfect circles. Not just one classroom, multiple rooms, different nights. Always 7 chairs, in a precise circle with one desk moved to the exact center. The arrangements were too perfect to be random, too deliberate to be some kind of accident or prank. When I'd straighten everything back to normal, it would be rearranged again by the next night. I started taking pictures with my phone to document what I was finding, thinking maybe I could show them to Principal Morrison and convince her we had a serious break-in problem. That's when I installed the motion sensors. I bought 3 battery-powered units from the hardware store in town and set them up in different parts of the building. 1 in the main hallway, 1 in the library, and 1 in the gym. They were designed to detect any movement larger than a house cat and would beep on my phone whenever they were triggered. The first night I used them, all 3 went off within minutes of each other around 11 p.m. But when I checked the areas, I found nothing. No signs of entry, no evidence that anyone had been there. The second night, the sensors went off in a pattern that should have been impossible. The one in the hallway triggered, then immediately the library sensor, then the gym sensor, then back to the hallway. All within about 30 seconds. For someone to move that fast between those locations, they would have had to be running full speed, and I would have heard them. But the building was completely silent except for my own footsteps as I checked each area. By the third night, the motion sensors were going off constantly, sometimes all three at once, sometimes in rapid sequence, sometimes individually, but in no pattern I could make sense of. It was like something was testing them, figuring out how they worked, and deliberately triggering them. I started ignoring the alerts because checking them was pointless, and frankly beginning to scare me. That's when I found the hair. Different colors, different textures, freshly cut but not matching any of the current students or staff. Long gray hair that looked like it belonged to an elderly woman, though we didn't have any elderly female staff. Red hair with an unnatural sheen that didn't look quite human. Dark hair so black it seemed to absorb light, cut in a style I'd never seen on anyone in Pine Hollow. The hair would be scattered in classrooms, always in small piles, like someone had been grooming themselves or changing their appearance. I started keeping samples in plastic bags, thinking maybe I could have them tested or show them to the police, but within a day or two, the hair would disappear from the bags. Not the bags themselves, just the contents. Like whatever had left the hair behind didn't want evidence of its presence to exist for very long. The night I decided to hide and watch was November 30th. I'd told my supervisor I was dealing with a plumbing problem that might take all night to fix, so I wouldn't be following my normal routine. Instead, I hid in the supply closet near the main office with a clear view of the central hallway and waited. Around 11:15 p.m., I saw him. A student walking down the hallway with the confident stride of someone who belonged there. Male, probably a senior based on his height and build, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that looked perfectly normal. The problem was, I recognized him as Tommy Martinez, who had graduated 3 years ago and moved to Asheville for college. Tommy had been a good kid, polite and hardworking, and I remembered him well because he'd always said hello when he saw me working. But this wasn't Tommy. Not really. The walk was wrong. Too fluid, like his joints were moving in directions they shouldn't. When he turned his head to look into classrooms, it swiveled further than a human neck should rotate. And when he stopped at Mrs. Patterson's door and stood there for a long moment, I could see his reflection in the glass, except the reflection didn't quite match his body. It was like watching a person wearing an ill-fitting costume where nothing lined up properly. I watched him enter the classroom and immediately begin mimicking teacher behavior. He walked to the whiteboard and started writing, though I couldn't see what. Then he sat at Mrs. Patterson's desk and began moving papers around like he was grading assignments. His posture was perfect, his movements deliberate, like he was practicing being a teacher. After about 10 minutes, he stood up, arranged the student desks in a different pattern, then walked back out into the hallway and disappeared toward the gym. The next night, I saw a different student. This time it was Michelle Webb, Marcus's older sister who had graduated 5 years ago. Same wrong movement patterns, same too fluid walk, same behavior of entering classrooms and practicing human activities. She spent time in the library, pulling books from shelves and reading them, but holding them upside down while moving her eyes across the pages like she was mimicking the act of reading without understanding what reading actually was. I started bringing a notebook to document what I was seeing. Different faces every night, but always former students. People who had graduated and moved away years ago. The thing was cycling through appearances, practicing different human forms, and it was getting better at the impersonation each night. The movements became more natural, the behavior more convincing. Whatever this thing was, it was studying us, learning how to be human by wearing the faces of people who used to belong here. That's when I found its collection. In the basement storage area behind the boiler, there was a space I'd never bothered to explore thoroughly. It was supposed to be sealed off, but the door had been forced open from the inside. Behind it was a room that had probably been used for storage when the school was first built. Now it was filled with photographs. Hundreds of school photos from the past 30 years, arranged in neat rows along the walls. Yearbook pictures, class photos, candid shots from school events, all featuring students who had graduated and left Pine Hollow years ago. In the center of the room was a pile of hair clippings in every color and texture imaginable, along with what looked like fingernail clippings and small pieces of what might have been skin. The thing wasn't just mimicking appearances. It was literally collecting materials to build them. I realized then that the missing students' belongings weren't random theft. The creature was studying current students, learning their sizes and styles, collecting samples of their clothing to practice wearing human appearances that would fit in at the school. It was preparing to infiltrate during school hours by impersonating people who belonged there. The next week, the teachers started reporting seeing students in 2 places at the same time. Jenny Caldwell was in both English and math class simultaneously, according to her teachers. Marcus Webb was spotted in the hallway while he was sitting in study hall. At first, everyone assumed it was simple mistakes, similar-looking kids or teachers getting confused about who was where. But the reports kept coming, and they were too specific to be explained away. Students began complaining that their friends were acting strangely, not dramatically different, just slightly off in ways that were hard to explain. Someone's laugh would sound wrong, or they'd forget things they should remember, or they'd react to references and inside jokes with confusion. Kids who had known each other for years were suddenly uncertain about their relationships. I knew what was happening. The creature had moved beyond practicing after hours. It was now impersonating current students during school days, walking among us, studying us from within our own community. And it was getting good enough that people couldn't tell the difference. The thing that made my blood run cold was realizing what it was choosing to study. Not the popular kids, not the athletes or the class presidents. It was targeting the quiet ones, the students who kept to themselves, the kids who might not be missed immediately if they didn't show up for a few days. Kids like I had been at that age. I tried to warn Principal Morrison, but how do you explain something like that? I couldn't bring her photographs of former students because I had no proof they were actually in the building. I couldn't show her the hair samples because they kept disappearing. The motion sensors just looked like regular equipment malfunction, and the rearranged furniture could be explained as custodial error or student pranks. When I started watching more carefully during the day, staying past my usual shift to observe classes and hallway interactions, I noticed the creature watching me back. It started small. I'd catch glimpses of myself in windows and mirrors around the school, but I'd be standing in a different location. Not dramatically different, just enough to make me doubt what I was seeing. Then students started mentioning conversations with me that I didn't remember having. Teachers would thank me for maintenance work I hadn't done. Mrs. Patterson commented on how much more efficient and pleasant I'd become lately, which confused me because I hadn't changed my routine or attitude at all. That's when I understood. The creature wasn't just studying students anymore. It had moved on to me. I began seeing myself working in other parts of the building while I was somewhere else entirely. Not just glimpses or reflections, the full figure of Bob Jenkins, complete with my slight limp from an old injury, my specific way of organizing cleaning supplies, even my tendency to hum while I worked. The imitation was perfect down to details I didn't realize I had, mannerisms I wasn't conscious of making. The worst part was that the fake Bob was better at the job than I was. Students smiled and said hello to him in ways they never had with me. Teachers stopped to chat with him about their weekends and their families. He was more efficient, more organized, more personable. The creature had taken my appearance and improved on it, making me into the version of myself that people actually wanted to interact with. Within 2 weeks, I realized that most people at the school preferred the creature's version of me to the real one. When I tried to prove I was the genuine Bob Jenkins, pointing out inconsistencies or trying to demonstrate knowledge only I would have, I came across as paranoid and unstable compared to the calm, competent janitor everyone else knew. The school administration started questioning my performance. Principal Morrison called me into her office to discuss what she diplomatically called behavioral changes and concerns about consistency. She suggested I might benefit from some time off to deal with what she clearly thought was a personal crisis. The irony was that the creature was doing my job better than I ever had, so from everyone else's perspective, I was the problem that needed to be solved. I tried staying away from the school for a few days, thinking maybe the creature would move on to a different target if I wasn't around to study. But when I came back, nothing had changed. If anything, the creature had used the time to perfect its Bob Jenkins impersonation even further. It now knew details about my personal life that it shouldn't have had access to. My divorce, my ex-wife's name, stories about my childhood that I'd never shared with anyone at the school. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with something that was simply mimicking appearances. This thing was somehow accessing my memories, my personality, my entire identity, and using that information to become a better version of me than I actually was. The final straw came on a Tuesday in December. I arrived for my evening shift to find the real Bob Jenkins, the creature wearing my face, training a new janitor, a young man named David who had apparently been hired to replace me. When I tried to interrupt, to prove that I was the real Bob Jenkins, both men looked at me with a mixture of pity and concern that made it clear they thought I was having some kind of breakdown. The creature wearing my face was patient and kind, as it explained to the principal that I had been dealing with stress and confusion lately, and that it might be best if I took some time to get help. It spoke about me with the caring tone of someone who genuinely wanted what was best for my mental health, which made it impossible for anyone else to see the situation as anything other than a sad case of workplace burnout. I left the school that night knowing I could never go back, not as the janitor, anyway. The creature had taken my job, my identity, and my place in the community, and it had done so by becoming a better version of me than I had ever been capable of being. I still live in Pine Hollow, but I keep to myself more than ever now. I see the new Bob Jenkins around town sometimes, chatting with neighbors, helping elderly folks with their groceries, being the kind of community member I never quite managed to be. People speak well of him, and from what I hear, the school runs more smoothly than it ever did when I was working there. Sometimes I wonder if what happened was really so terrible. The creature never hurt anyone, never caused harm beyond taking my place. Maybe it was just lonely, looking for a way to belong somewhere, and it found that by being a better version of the people it encountered, maybe the students and teachers are actually better off with the improved Bob Jenkins than they ever were with me. But I still don't sleep well at night, wondering if it's moved on to someone else by now, someone who might not be as easily replaced as a quiet janitor who never quite fit in anyway. I keep thinking about those photographs in the basement, all those former students whose faces it had learned to wear, and I wonder what happened to the originals, whether they're out there, somewhere, living different lives, or whether they found themselves in situations like mine, replaced by versions of themselves that everyone else preferred. I don't talk about what happened, because who would believe it? And honestly, part of me isn't sure I want anyone to believe it. The thing is still out there, still learning, still becoming better at being human than most of us actually are. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe that's just evolution at work. But I still check my mirrors carefully, and I pay attention to my own behavior, watching for signs that I might not be myself anymore. Because the scariest part isn't that something took my place. It's that it took my place so easily, and everyone was happier with the replacement. I'm 31 years old and work as a rural mail carrier for the U.S. Postal Service. I've been delivering mail around Whisper Creek, West Virginia for about 3 years now. It's not glamorous work, but it pays decent and lets me drive through some of the most beautiful country you'll ever see. Whisper Creek's got maybe 95 people on a good day, scattered across hollows and ridges that don't even show up on most GPS systems. The kind of place where your mail route includes houses that haven't been painted since the Carter administration and people who still heat with wood stoves. I grew up about an hour south of here, so I'm used to mountain living. My girlfriend Sarah lives in town, well, what passes for town anyway. And we've been talking about getting married once I save up enough for a decent ring. Nothing fancy, just something that shows I'm serious about our future. The postal job was supposed to be temporary while I figured out what I really wanted to do with my life, but 3 years in, and I'm starting to think maybe this is it. There's something peaceful about driving those mountain roads every day, seeing the same faces, knowing that people depend on you to bring them their social security checks and birthday cards from grandchildren who moved to the city. The route covers about 47 miles of winding mountain roads, and I know every pothole and sharp curve by heart. Mrs. Patterson at the end of Hickory Ridge Road always has her dog Buster waiting by the mailbox, tail wagging. Tom Miller, down on Creek Bottom Road, usually waves from his front porch if he's not out working on that old Chevy of his. Sarah Jenkins, different Sarah from my girlfriend, runs the little general store, and always asks about my family when I drop off her mail. These are good people, the kind who'll bring you a casserole if you're sick and help you move furniture without being asked. They've been here for generations, and their families' names are carved on headstones in the little cemetery behind the Methodist church. The thing about rural mail routes is that you get to know people's lives just by what shows up in their mailboxes. You know who's having money troubles by the collection agency letters, who's got health problems by all the medical bills, who's expecting grandchildren by the baby supply catalogs. It's not that I'm nosy, it's just that after a while, you start caring about these folks like they're your own family. November was when things started getting weird. Though, looking back now, I think the signs were there earlier, and I just didn't want to see them. It began with packages showing up that didn't have return addresses. Not unusual by itself. Plenty of people send gifts and forget to write their address on the label. But these packages were different. They were always perfectly wrapped, like someone had taken their time with them, and they were addressed to people in handwriting I didn't recognize. Clean, careful, cursive that looked almost old-fashioned. The first one I remember clearly was addressed to Mrs. Patterson on Hickory Ridge Road. Route Box 12, just like always. But when I got to her house, she looked at the package like she'd never seen it before. Said she wasn't expecting anything and didn't know who might have sent it. I figured maybe it was from some distant relative or something, but she seemed genuinely confused. The weird part was what was inside. I found out later because she called the post office to report it. It was a photo album full of pictures of her and her late husband, but she swore she'd never seen the photos before. Said they were taken places they'd never been, doing things they'd never done, but it was definitely them in the pictures. That same week, I had another delivery for a Mrs. Patterson. Same name, same address format, but this one was for Route Box 67, which is way over on the other side of my route. When I pulled up to that address, and I had to check my maps 3 times because I'd never delivered there before. There was a house that looked exactly like Mrs. Patterson's place on Hickory Ridge Road. Same blue shutters, same front porch with the swing, same flower boxes under the windows. And when the woman came to the door, she looked exactly like Mrs. Patterson. Same gray hair pulled back in a bun, same weathered hands, same way of standing with one hip cocked to the side. But when I said, "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," she got this confused look on her face and said, "I'm sorry, honey, but I think you've got me mixed up with someone else. My name's Margaret Winters. I don't know any Mrs. Patterson." Her voice was exactly the same too, that slight mountain accent with the way she stretched out her vowels. Even the way she called me honey was identical. I apologized and handed her the package, but driving away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I'd been delivering mail to Mrs. Patterson for 3 years. I knew her face better than I knew my own mother's. And this woman wasn't just similar. She was identical. Same age spots on her hands, same little scar over her left eyebrow from when she fell off her bike as a kid, same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. But she seemed genuinely convinced that she was someone else entirely. When I got back to the post office that evening, I talked to my supervisor, Jim Henley. He's been working postal routes in these mountains for over 20 years, so I figured he'd have an explanation. "Rural families up in those hollows," he said, not looking up from his paperwork. "They intermarry a lot over the generations. You get families where cousins and second cousins all look alike. Sometimes it's so close it's downright spooky. I've seen it before." That made sense, I guess, but it still bothered me. Over the next few weeks, it kept happening. Tom Miller showed up at 3 different addresses on my route. Each time, I delivered mail to Tom Miller at what looked like the exact same house. Same green aluminum siding, same gravel driveway, same rusty Ford pickup in the yard. And each time, it was definitely Tom. Same thick gray beard, same missing finger on his left hand from a sawmill accident, same habit of scratching his belly while he talked. But each Tom insisted he was the real one and didn't know anything about the other Toms I'd supposedly seen. The third Tom actually got angry when I mentioned the others. "Listen here," he said, pointing that 9-fingered hand at me. "I've lived in this house for 32 years, and I don't appreciate you telling me there's other people pretending to be me. You sure you ain't getting confused? Maybe you need to lay off whatever you've been drinking." But I wasn't confused, and I wasn't drinking. I started keeping a logbook of the weird deliveries, writing down addresses and descriptions. The pattern was clear. People I'd known for years were showing up at multiple addresses, living in identical houses, receiving mail under the same names but insisting they were different people. And the packages always contained personal items that belonged to the original person I knew: family photos, jewelry, letters, things that should have been impossible for strangers to have. What really started to scare me was when I realized that the original people, the ones I'd been delivering to for 3 years, were becoming harder and harder to find. Mrs. Patterson's dog Buster still waited by the mailbox on Hickory Ridge Road, but Mrs. Patterson herself was rarely around. When I did see her, she seemed different somehow, more careful in her movements, like she was thinking about each gesture before she made it, and her conversation was off. She'd always been chatty, asking about my family and telling stories about her grandchildren. But now she'd just nod and take her mail without saying much. The worst part was when I started getting packages addressed to people who lived in the same house as the addressee, but with slightly different names. Sarah Jenkins at the general store got a package addressed to Sarah Jenkins, exactly the same name, but the sender's note claimed they were for a different Sarah Jenkins who lived at the same address. When Sarah opened it in front of me, it was full of the exact same jewelry she was wearing. The same silver bracelet, the same turquoise earrings, even the same high school class ring. But according to the package, these belonged to the other Sarah Jenkins. "This is impossible," she said, holding up a bracelet identical to the one on her wrist. "This is my grandmother's bracelet. There's only one of them. I've worn it every day for 10 years. She looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Not confusion, but something deeper. Fear, maybe. "David, what the hell is going on?" I wish I'd had an answer for her. By this point, I was spending my evenings driving around my route, trying to map out all these duplicate addresses. The thing was, they weren't showing up on any of my official postal maps. According to the GPS system in my truck, half of these houses didn't exist. But I was delivering mail to them every day, talking to people who looked exactly like people I'd known for years. One evening in late November, I decided to follow one of the delivery routes off the main roads. The address was for Tom Miller, one of the 3 Toms, and it led me down a dirt road I'd never noticed before, even though it was right off Route 9, which I'd driven hundreds of times. The road wasn't on my GPS, wasn't on any of my maps, but there it was, clear as day, with a rusty mailbox at the end marked T. Miller. The house at the end of that road was exactly like Tom's real house, down to the paint peeling off the front steps and the old tire swing hanging from the oak tree in the yard. But something about it felt wrong. Too perfect, maybe. Like someone had built it from a photograph, getting all the details right but missing something essential. I sat in my truck for a few minutes, watching the house. There was Tom, sitting on his front porch just like always, working on carving a piece of wood with his pocket knife. Same flannel shirt, same worn-out boots, same way of holding his head tilted slightly to the right when he concentrated. But his movements were too deliberate, too careful. Real Tom always carved absent-mindedly, his hands working while his mind wandered. This Tom was focusing on each cut like he was following instructions. I was about to drive away when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were other people moving around inside the house, visible through the windows. A woman who looked like Tom's wife, Martha, and 2 kids who looked like his grandchildren. But Martha had died 5 years ago from cancer, and his grandchildren lived in Ohio. I'd delivered sympathy cards to Tom after Martha's funeral. I'd been to the burial. I'd watched him cry over her grave. Yet there she was, moving around the kitchen, setting the table for dinner, and the kids were playing in the living room, laughing and running around like normal children. It was like watching a family that had never experienced loss, never been touched by grief or separation. A perfect family frozen in time before tragedy struck. That's when I realized what I was looking at wasn't just people who resembled my mail route customers. These were exact copies, living in exact replicas of their homes, but with one crucial difference. They were living idealized versions of their lives. Tom with his dead wife back. Families reunited. Hard lives softened and perfected. I started my truck and got out of there as fast as I could, my hands shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. But even as I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the look on Tom's face. He'd glanced up at me when I pulled away, and for just a second, his expression had changed. The careful, practiced movements stopped, and something else looked out from behind his eyes, something that had been studying me just as carefully as I'd been watching him. The next morning, I called in sick. I'd never used a sick day in 3 years of working for the Postal Service, but I couldn't bring myself to get in that truck and drive my route. Instead, I spent the day at Sarah's apartment, trying to explain what I'd been seeing without sounding completely insane. She listened patiently, but I could tell she thought the job was getting to me. "Maybe you need to take some vacation time," she said, rubbing my shoulders. "You've been working too hard, and these mountain roads can play tricks on your mind, especially when you're tired." But I knew what I'd seen, and more importantly, I knew that whatever was happening was getting worse. The next day, when I finally went back to work, there was another David Park waiting at the post office. Same height, same hair, same uniform. He was talking to Jim Henley about some changes to the route schedule, discussing details about deliveries that only I should have known. When I walked into the office, both of them looked at me like I was a stranger. "Can I help you?" the other David asked, and his voice was my voice, down to the slight hoarseness I get when I'm tired. Jim nodded toward him and said, "David here was just telling me about some irregular delivery patterns on his route. Been having some concerns about security protocols." "I'm David," I said, but even as the words came out of my mouth, I knew how crazy they sounded. The other David, my replacement, just smiled sadly and said, "Sir, I think you might be confused. I've been working this route for 3 years. Maybe you should talk to someone about getting some help." I backed out of the office, my heart pounding. Outside in the parking lot, I could hear them talking about me through the window. "Poor guy," the fake David was saying. "Probably some kind of breakdown. Mountain isolation can do that to people sometimes. I feel bad for him. He was good, better than good. He was perfect. He knew my work history, my relationships with customers, probably even my social security number and bank account information. Whoever or whatever was creating these copies had been studying us long enough to replicate everything that mattered." I drove home in a panic, but when I got to my apartment, Sarah was there waiting for me. Except it wasn't Sarah. This woman had Sarah's face, Sarah's voice, Sarah's way of standing with her arms crossed when she was worried. But when she looked at me, there was something calculating behind her eyes, something that was trying to figure out how Sarah would react to seeing me upset. "Hey baby," she said, and her voice was just slightly off. Too careful, like she was testing each word before saying it. "I was worried about you. You didn't answer your phone today." I'd never called her. The real Sarah would have known that. "Who are you?" I asked, backing toward the door. She tilted her head, confused. "David, what's wrong?" "It's me, Sarah." "Are you feeling okay? You look pale." But she was wearing the wrong earrings. Sarah always wore the turquoise ones her grandmother gave her. This woman was wearing silver studs that looked expensive and new. Small detail, but Sarah would never forget her grandmother's earrings. They were too important to her. I ran. I got in my truck and drove until I hit the interstate, not stopping until I was 3 counties away. From a motel room in Charleston, I called the real Sarah's number, but a voice that sounded exactly like mine answered the phone. "Davidson Residence," my own voice said, which was wrong on 2 levels. Sarah's last name was Rodriguez, and I'd never answered her phone that formally in my life. "Is Sarah there?" I asked. "I'm sorry, who's calling?" "This is David, her boyfriend." There was a pause then. "I think you might have the wrong number, sir. There's no Sarah here, and I don't have a boyfriend." The line went dead. I spent 3 days in that motel room, afraid to go back, afraid to stay, afraid to call anyone else I knew because I didn't know who might answer. On the 3rd day, I drove back toward Whisper Creek, but I didn't go home. Instead, I parked on a ridge overlooking the town and watched through binoculars as my life continued without me. There was my truck, making the mail deliveries. There was my replacement, talking and laughing with customers who seemed perfectly happy to see him. There was the fake Sarah, going about her daily business, working at the general store like nothing had changed. From a distance, it all looked completely normal. A perfect little mountain community where everyone knew each other and life moved at its own, peaceful pace. But I knew the truth. Everyone I'd cared about, everyone I'd worked with, everyone I'd known, they were gone. Replaced by something that could copy their appearance and memories but not their souls. Whatever was behind this had been patient, studying us for weeks or maybe months, learning our routines and relationships and personalities until they could slip into our lives without anyone noticing. I never went back to Whisper Creek. I drove east until I hit the ocean, then south until I found work in a city big enough that nobody asks too many questions about where you came from or why you don't talk about your past. I got a job with a different postal service branch, delivering mail in suburban neighborhoods where everyone looks different and the houses are numbered in logical order. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder about those packages with no return addresses. I wonder if whatever replaced my life in Whisper Creek is still there, still playing house with my memories and relationships. I wonder if the fake David is happy with the fake Sarah, if they're planning a fake wedding with a fake ring bought with money from a fake bank account. And I wonder if it's spreading. If other mail carriers in other small towns are starting to notice duplicate addresses and identical faces and packages full of impossible personal items. If somewhere out there, another postal worker is sitting in their truck, watching themselves deliver mail to people who used to be their friends. I don't talk about this with anyone. Who would believe it? Sometimes I almost convince myself that I imagined the whole thing, that the stress of rural isolation finally got to me and I had some kind of breakdown. It would be easier to believe that than to accept what I really saw. But then I check my personnel file, and there's no record of me ever working in West Virginia. According to the Postal Service, I've been delivering mail in North Carolina my entire career. David Park from Whisper Creek doesn't exist in their system. Never did. Sometimes I drive through small towns and look for my old postal truck, the one with the dent in the passenger door from where Tom Miller's dog jumped up to say hello that first week I worked the route. I haven't seen it yet, but I keep looking. I figure if that thing is still out there, still pretending to be me, then maybe the real people from Whisper Creek are still out there too, somewhere. Maybe we're all driving around, displaced from our own lives, looking for signs that what happened to us was real. I still deliver mail. Different route, different state, different life. But I pay attention now to details I used to ignore. I make note of who gets what, packages, who lives where, who looks like who. And if I ever start seeing duplicate addresses or identical faces or packages with no return addresses, I'll know it's time to run again. Because whatever took over Whisper Creek, whatever studied us and copied us and replaced us, it's patient, it's thorough, and it's probably not finished. I'm 48 years old, and I've been running Morrison's Hardware in Black Rock, West Virginia for the past 12 years. It's not much to look at. Just a single-story building with peeling paint and a creaky wooden floor that announces every customer who walks through the door. But in a town of 85 people, nestled deep in the mountains where the nearest Walmart is 60 miles of winding roads away, my little store is pretty much essential. I sell everything from roofing nails to kerosene heaters, and honestly, I know most of my customers by their first names and what projects they're working on before they even tell me. I moved here after my divorce back in 2012, looking for something simple and quiet. Sarah got the house in Charleston, I got the debt, and somehow I scraped together enough to buy this place from old Mr. Henley when his arthritis got too bad for him to keep up with it. The mountains suited me fine. Less people, less drama, and the kind of work where you solve problems with your hands instead of sitting behind a desk all day. My customers are good people, loggers, a few folks who work at the coal processing plant over in Beckley, families who've been on the same land for generations. They pay their bills, they don't cause trouble, and they appreciate that I stay open when they need something fixed right away. Most of the year, business follows a pretty predictable pattern. Spring brings requests for garden supplies and fence repair materials. Summer means lumber for deck repairs and tools for hay cutting. Fall is usually quiet except for hunting season prep, gun cleaning supplies, heavy rope, that sort of thing. Winter means heating equipment, pipe insulation, and the occasional emergency call when someone's generator quits working. I'd gotten comfortable with these rhythms, comfortable with knowing what people needed before they needed it. But November of 2023 was different right from the start. The first week alone, I sold more heavy-duty chain than I usually move in 6 months. Tommy Briggs came in Tuesday morning asking for 50 feet of quarter-inch steel cable, the kind you'd use to secure a load on a logging truck. When I asked what he was hauling, he just shook his head and said he was reinforcing some things around the house. Wednesday, the Kellerman family, Mom, Dad, and their 2 teenage boys, bought enough metal sheeting to site a barn, along with a dozen heavy-duty padlocks and about 30 pounds of 3-inch screws. Industrial stuff, not the kind of hardware you use for normal home repairs. I'd known these families for years, and they weren't the type to make frivolous purchases. Money's always tight in the mountains, and folks don't spend on materials they don't absolutely need. But here they were, buying supplies like they were preparing for some kind of siege. The weird part wasn't just what they were buying, it was how they acted while buying it. Nervous glances at the windows, hushed, conversations that stopped when I got close enough to hear, and this underlying tension that made the whole store feel different. By the second week of November, I was getting orders that didn't make any sense for the season. Martha Pennington, whose husband died 3 years back, and who usually only bought small items like screws or weather stripping, ordered enough lumber and hardware cloth to build a chicken coop the size of a small house. When her order came in, her sons arrived with a truck to pick it up, and I noticed they'd already reinforced the truck bed with additional steel plating. These weren't construction improvements, they were fortifications. The pattern kept building. The Morrison clan, no relation, despite the name, bought enough steel reinforcement materials to turn their farmhouse into a bunker. Jim Crawford ordered so many motion sensor lights that I had to special order them from my supplier in Charleston. The weirdest request came from Beth Sullivan, the school principal, who asked if I could get security bars that would fit the windows of the old schoolhouse. When I asked why the school needed security bars, she just said they were taking some precautions and left it at that. I started paying closer attention to my deliveries. Living in a small town, I'd always made house calls for larger orders, especially for older customers or families without reliable transportation. What I saw during those November deliveries still bothers me when I think about it. Houses that had looked normal just weeks before were being transformed into something that looked like they were preparing for war. The Briggs place had new steel shutters on every window, welded from the inside. Their front porch, which used to be open and welcoming, was now enclosed with heavy mesh fencing. When I delivered their cable order, I noticed they'd dug what looked like a trench around the entire house, filled with some kind of metal spikes. Tommy saw me looking and just said they were having trouble with something getting too close to the house at night. At the Kellerman farm, the metal sheeting I'd sold them was being used to create a secondary barrier around their existing fences. They'd basically built a fence inside their fence, creating a buffer zone around their property. Their barn had been reinforced with the steel beams they'd ordered, and I could see they'd installed some kind of underground shelter near the back of their property. The boys were practicing what looked like military drills, running from the house to the barn to the shelter in timed sequences. Every family seemed to be preparing for the same undefined threat, but nobody would tell me what it was. I'd lived here for 12 years, and I'd never seen anything like this level of preparation for anything. Not winter storms, not the occasional black bear that wandered down from the higher elevations. Nothing. It was like the whole community was following some plan I wasn't aware of. The thing that really got my attention was how coordinated everything seemed. These weren't isolated families making random security improvements. They were working together, sharing materials, and coordinating their efforts. I'd see trucks moving between properties at all hours, usually carrying more of the heavy-duty supplies I'd been selling. Men who normally worked alone were collaborating on construction projects, and families who usually kept to themselves were suddenly holding regular meetings. I finally got some answers when Clara Henderson came into the store the third week of November. Clara's family has been in these mountains since before West Virginia was even a state, and at 73, she's seen more seasons come and go than anyone else in town. She was buying kerosene and extra lamp oil, which wasn't unusual, but she also wanted to know if I could get my hands on any portable generators that ran quiet. When I asked why she needed a quiet generator, she looked at me for a long moment, then asked if I'd noticed anything strange about how the animals had been acting lately. Now that she mentioned it, I had. The usual sounds of the mountains, birds, squirrels, even the insects, had gone quiet over the past couple of weeks. I'd attributed it to the cold weather moving in, but Clara shook her head. "Frank," she said, "your family's new to these parts, so there's things you wouldn't know. Things the old families don't talk about much, especially to folks who might not believe." She glanced around the store like she was making sure we were alone, then continued. "Every few years, when November gets cold enough, something comes down from the high mountains. Something that's been coming here longer than any of our families have been here." I must have looked skeptical because she held up her hand. "I know how it sounds, but our grandparents knew about it, their grandparents knew about it, and we know about it. It's why we stay prepared, it's why we help each other when November comes around. And it's why your store becomes so important this time of year." Clara explained that the community had learned, over generations, how to protect themselves during what they called hunting season. It wasn't hunting for deer or turkey, it was hunting season for something else entirely, something that came down from the deeper wilderness when the temperature dropped and food became scarce in the higher elevations. The families had developed a system of mutual protection, using their homes as temporary fortresses and coordinating watch schedules to make sure no one was alone during the most dangerous periods. "The thing is," Clara said, "it's smart, smarter than people give it credit for. It learns how we protect ourselves and it adapts. That's why we have to change our methods every few years, why we need new materials and different approaches." She gestured around my store. "Your supplies, Frank. They're not just convenience purchases, they're survival equipment." I asked her what exactly this thing was, and her expression got grim. "Big, old, patient, and it knows the difference between people who belong here and people who don't. It knows about families, about patterns, about who's most vulnerable." She paused, then added, "It's been watching your place, Frank. Watching you. Watching your routines. November's when it decides who it's going to hunt." That night, I stayed late at the store, going through my inventory and thinking about everything Clara had told me. Around 10 p.m., I was finishing up my paperwork when I heard something scraping against the outside wall of the building. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like something was testing the strength of the wooden siding. I grabbed my flashlight and went to investigate, but when I opened the door, there was nothing there. What I did find were gouges in the wood siding, long parallel scratches that went deep enough to expose the bare lumber underneath. They were about 8 feet off the ground, far higher than any bear could reach, and they formed a pattern that suggested whatever made them had been systematically testing the structural integrity of the building. The scratches were fresh. I could smell the pine sap where the claws had cut through the wood. I called Tommy Briggs, figuring if anyone would know what to do, it would be someone who'd lived here his whole life. He came over within 20 minutes, carrying a rifle and a high-powered flashlight. When he saw the claw marks, his face went pale. "Frank," he said, "you can't stay here alone anymore. Not during November. This thing doesn't attack randomly. It studies its targets first, learns their routines, figures out their weaknesses. These marks mean you're being evaluated." Over the next few days, I learned more about the community's protection network than I'd learned in 12 years of living here. Families took turns on watch duty, monitoring the roads and radio frequencies for signs of movement. They developed a system of signals, certain arrangements of lights, specific radio calls, that let everyone know when the threat was active. My store, because of its central location and the fact that I had the best radio equipment in town, became an unofficial coordination center. The families started leaving supplies at my store: weapons, ammunition, medical kits, and emergency communication equipment. Clara brought me a detailed map showing safe routes between properties and marking locations where the thing had been spotted in previous years. The map went back decades, and the pattern was clear. Every few years, usually in November, there would be a concentration of sightings in our area, followed by disappearances. "The families who've been here longest," Tommy explained, "they know how to work together when this happens. But newcomers, people who don't understand the threat or don't believe in it, they're the ones who get picked off." I asked why they didn't just leave during November, relocate somewhere safer until the threat passed. The answer was depressingly practical. Money. Most families here were tied to the land economically. They had jobs they couldn't afford to lose, livestock they couldn't abandon, property they couldn't leave unprotected. And besides, as Clara pointed out, their families had been dealing with this threat for generations. Running away wasn't an option when the thing would just be here waiting for them when they came back. The first actual sighting happened on a Tuesday night around midnight. I was sleeping in the back room of the store. The families had insisted I not go home alone during peak hunting season. When my radio crackled to life, it was Jim Crawford reporting movement near his property line. Large figure, moving on two legs, approximately 8 feet tall. His voice whispered through the static. It's been circling my house for the past hour, testing doors and windows. Seems to be examining the new reinforcements. Other families checked in over the next few minutes, confirming they'd secured their properties and were maintaining watch. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Whatever this thing was, it spent significant time at each location, not trying to break in immediately, but instead studying the defensive measures, looking for weaknesses, learning how each family had adapted their security. Around 2 a.m., my motion sensors went off. I'd installed a system around the store based on recommendations from the community, and the alerts showed movement on all sides of the building. Through my security monitors, I could see a massive shape moving in the darkness, staying just outside the range of my floodlights but clearly visible as something wrong. Too tall, moving with a gait that wasn't quite human but intelligent enough to avoid triggering the more obvious detection systems. The thing spent almost an hour circling my store, and I could hear it testing different sections of the building. The scraping sounds from the walls, the gentle pressure on doors and windows, even what sounded like it trying to manipulate the lock on my front entrance. It wasn't trying to break in forcefully, it was learning how the building was secured, understanding what it would need to do to gain access when it decided the time was right. Around dawn, the radio traffic picked up again as families reported the thing moving away, heading back toward the higher elevations. But the message was clear. It had cataloged every property in our area, studied our defensive measures, and identified potential targets for future visits. The next few nights followed a similar pattern. The thing would come down from the mountains after dark, spend hours studying our community, then retreat before sunrise. Each night, it seemed to focus on different properties, learning about our coordination efforts, and testing different approaches to our defenses. What made it truly terrifying was how intelligent it clearly was. Tommy reported that it had figured out how to trigger false alarms on his motion detectors, setting them off repeatedly until he turned them off in frustration, then approaching his house during the brief window when his warning system was disabled. The Kellermans discovered that it had somehow gotten into their barn and rearranged tools and equipment, not stealing anything but demonstrating that their barriers weren't as secure as they'd believed. For me, the worst discovery came when I arrived at the store one morning to find that it had been inside during the night. Nothing was damaged, nothing was stolen, but my inventory had been methodically examined. Tools had been moved from their normal locations, sorted and arranged in ways that showed a clear understanding of their function. Security equipment had been taken apart and reassembled, as if the thing was studying how our defensive systems worked. Most disturbing of all, my radio equipment had been tuned to our emergency frequencies. It had been listening to our coordination efforts, learning about our communication protocols, understanding how we work together to maintain security. The thing wasn't just hunting us individually, it was learning about our community defense systems. That's when Clara called an emergency meeting at my store. All the families gathered after dark, and she explained what previous generations had learned about dealing with this threat. Fighting it directly doesn't work, she said. It's too big, too smart, too patient. But our ancestors figured out something that does work: negotiation. The idea was horrifying but practical. Instead of trying to fight off something they couldn't defeat, the community had learned to manage the threat through appeasement. They would select community members for sacrifice, usually people who were isolated, sick, or already vulnerable, and guide the thing toward those targets while protecting the majority of the population. It's not random hunting, Clara explained. It's intelligent hunting. It understands community structures, family relationships, economic importance. If we help it select appropriate targets, it will leave the essential population alone. The families had done this before. During previous hunting seasons, they would identify people who could be sacrificed without destroying the community's survival capacity then subtly direct the thing toward those targets while ensuring everyone else remained protected. It was brutal, but it was effective, and it allowed the core community to survive. My role in this system was crucial because of my store's central location and because I had detailed knowledge of everyone's defensive preparations. I knew who was most vulnerable, who had the weakest security, who lived alone or had the fewest community connections. I would help identify suitable targets and coordinate the community's efforts to guide the thing toward those people while protecting everyone else. The first sacrifice happened the following week. Martha Pennington, the widow who'd been buying unusual amounts of construction materials, was selected because she lived alone, had no immediate family in the area, and her property was isolated enough that her disappearance could be explained as a simple accident. We guided the thing toward her property by adjusting our patrol schedules and removing some of the early warning systems that would have alerted her to the approaching threat. It was quick and efficient. She disappeared on a Thursday night, and by Friday morning, there was no trace of her, except for some bloodstains near her back door and damage to her fortifications that showed how the thing had finally gained access. The community held a memorial service and explained her death as a result of a bear attack, which was plausible enough that outside authorities didn't investigate further. The system worked exactly as Clara had described. After taking Martha, the thing's hunting behavior changed. It still came down from the mountains, but instead of studying our defenses and testing our security, it seemed satisfied with its kill. The nightly visits continued, but they felt more like patrol behavior than active hunting. Over the winter, we sacrificed 3 more people: an elderly man with no family, a mentally ill woman who lived as a hermit, and a drifter who'd been working temporary jobs in the area. Each selection was carefully made to minimize impact on the community's essential population, and each sacrifice bought us several weeks of relative safety. I'm still here, still running Morrison's Hardware, still serving as the community's coordination center during hunting season. November 2024 is coming up again, and I've already started stocking the supplies we'll need for this year's protective measures. The families trust me now in a way they didn't before, because I proved I could make the hard decisions necessary for community survival. Looking back, I understand why the old families never talked about this with newcomers. It's not the kind of knowledge you can share until someone has proven they belong here, proven they're committed to the community's survival above their individual moral concerns. The thing in the mountains is part of the reality of living here, like severe weather or economic hardship. You adapt to it, you manage it, and you do what's necessary to protect the people who matter. I've already started identifying potential targets for this year's hunting season. There's a homeless veteran who's been camping on abandoned property outside town, a family of drug addicts who moved here from Ohio, and an elderly woman whose dementia has made her a burden on her relatives. When November gets cold enough, and the thing comes down from the mountains again, I'll be ready to help guide it toward appropriate choices. It's not the life I expected when I moved here, but it's the life that keeps me and my community alive. The mountains teach you hard lessons about survival. And the hardest lesson is that sometimes protecting the people you care about means sacrificing the people you don't. I'm 45 years old, and I've been driving school bus for the county for going on 8 years now. Name's Janet Williams, and I live just outside Copper Falls, North Carolina, if you can even call it a town with only about 150 people scattered around these mountains. Most folks around here either work the quarry or drive into Asheville for jobs, but I like staying local. Route 12 has been mine for 3 years straight, serving all the kids in the hollows and ridges around here. 23 kids total, from kindergarten up to high school, and I know every single one of them like they were my own. I know which ones fight over seats, who gets carsick on the winding mountain roads, and which families are struggling to make ends meet. These mountains don't make life easy, but we all look out for each other. My route starts early, around 6:30 a.m., winding through dirt roads that aren't even on most maps. I pick up the Henderson kids first, then the 3 Miller children, work my way through Possum Creek Road, and end up at the school in town by 8:15. Same routine every day. And these kids had become like family to me. Little Sarah Henderson would always save me drawings she'd made the night before. The Miller boys would argue about baseball cards until I had to separate them. Marcus Webb, A quiet 8th grader, whose daddy worked the night shift, would always sit behind me and tell me about the books he was reading. Normal kid stuff, you know? The kind of chaos that reminds you there's still innocence in the world. I live alone in a small house that used to be my grandmother's, inherited when she passed 5 years back. My ex-husband and I never had children, something I always regretted, so these bus rides twice a day gave me a chance to be around young ones. The pay isn't much, but it's steady work, and honestly, I looked forward to seeing those faces every morning and afternoon. Their energy kept me going, especially during the long mountain winters when the sun barely seems to shine and the cold seeps into your bones no matter how much firewood you burn. November started like any other month. The leaves were mostly down by then, carpeting the roads in browns and golds that crunched under the bus tires. I remember thinking how quiet it seemed that first week, but I figured maybe the kids were just getting used to the shorter days and colder mornings. You know how children get when the weather changes. Sometimes they're more subdued, especially when they have to get up in the dark and wait at the end of long driveways for the bus headlights to find them. But looking back now, I can see it wasn't the weather at all. Something was changing in those children, something that would turn my whole understanding of the world upside down. I just didn't recognize it yet because it happened so gradually, like watching grass grow or paint dry. The kind of change that creeps up on you until one day you wake up and realize everything is completely different and you can't even pinpoint when it started. It was maybe the second week of November when I really started noticing how different the morning rides had become. The Henderson kids climbed on without their usual bickering about who got the window seat. Sarah, who normally bounced with excitement to show me her latest crayon masterpiece, just walked down the aisle and sat quietly, hands folded in her lap like she was in church. The Miller boys, who I'd had to separate more times than I could count, sat together peacefully, staring straight ahead through the windshield. At first, I thought maybe their parents had finally gotten through to them about bus behavior. Lord knows I'd talked to enough families over the years about their children acting up during the ride. But this wasn't just better behavior. This was like someone had replaced my regular kids with perfectly trained robots. They said good morning when they got on, answered when I asked them direct questions, but otherwise sat in complete silence for the entire 45-minute route. Marcus Webb still sat behind me, but instead of chattering about whatever science fiction book he was devouring that week, he just stared out the window. When I asked him about school, he'd give me short, polite answers. Fine, Mrs. Williams. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. Nothing more. This was a kid who used to tell me detailed plots of entire novels, who'd get so excited about a story that he'd forget to get off at his stop. Now he was like a stranger. The afternoon rides were even stranger. Usually, that's when kids are wound up from a full day at school, ready to cut loose and be loud. They'd compare homework assignments, trade snacks, complain about teachers, plan weekend activities, but that November, they'd file onto the bus like they were attending a funeral, take their assigned seats, and sit with their hands folded until I called their stop. No talking, no laughing, no normal childhood noise at all. I started paying closer attention to their faces during those rides. Something was different about their eyes. They seemed darker somehow, less bright than before. When they looked at me, it felt like they were seeing through me rather than at me. And they all had this same expression, like they were listening to something I couldn't hear, or thinking about things that were way too serious for children their ages. The really weird part was how their parents reacted when I mentioned it during my monthly parent conference calls. Every family said the same thing. Their children had become model students at home too, doing chores without being asked, completing homework without reminders, going to bed on time without arguments. The Hendersons told me Sarah had organized her entire room and was keeping it spotless. The Millers said their boys had stopped fighting completely and were helping around the house like never before. It's like Christmas came. Early, Mrs. Henderson laughed during our phone call. I don't know what you're doing on that bus, but keep it up. Sarah's been an absolute angel. But that was just it. They weren't acting like angels. Angels still have personality, still have that spark of life that makes children who they are. These kids were acting like they'd been drained of everything that made them unique, everything that made them human children, instead of well-programmed machines. The teachers at school were just as confused as I was, but in a good way. Principal Matthews called me into his office the third week of November, to thank me for whatever disciplinary techniques I was using. Test scores had gone up dramatically, classroom disruptions had dropped to 0, and homework completion was at 100% for every child on my route. The kids were answering questions in class with knowledge that seemed way beyond their grade levels, especially in science and mathematics. "I don't know what you're doing differently," he said, "but it's working miracles. These children are performing better than kids twice their age. We might need to consider advancing several of them to higher grades." I tried to tell him that I wasn't doing anything different, that the children's behavior was worrying me more than pleasing me, but he just laughed and said I was being too modest. He'd been in education for 30 years, he told me, and he'd never seen such a dramatic improvement in student performance across the board. That's when I started really watching the kids during recess from my bus window. I usually sat in the parking lot reading a book or doing crossword puzzles during the school day, but now I found myself studying the children instead. They moved differently than they used to. Instead of the random chaos of normal playground activity, they seemed to move in patterns, like they were performing some kind of choreographed dance. They'd arrange themselves in perfect, geometric shapes on the playground, circles, triangles, straight lines, and stand there for several minutes at a time before shifting into a new formation. No running, no shouting, no games. Just these strange, precise movements that looked more like a military drill than children at play. The teachers on playground duty didn't seem to notice anything unusual, or if they did, they weren't concerned about it. I watched them line up for lunch one day, and it was like seeing 23 perfect soldiers march in formation. Same pace, same posture, same blank expressions. When they came back outside after eating, I noticed none of them were carrying the usual lunchroom trash. Empty milk cartons, sandwich bags, apple cores. It was like they hadn't eaten anything at all. That afternoon, I asked little Sarah what she'd had for lunch. "I wasn't hungry, Mrs. Williams," she said in that same flat, polite voice they'd all developed. "But you need to eat to grow big and strong," I told her. "What did your mama pack for you today?" "I don't need to eat anymore," she replied, turning to stare out the window. "None of us do." The way she said it, like she was sharing some secret knowledge, sent chills down my spine. I asked the other kids about their lunches, and they all gave me similar answers. They weren't hungry, they didn't need food anymore. They were getting what they needed somewhere else. That night, I called my friend Beth, who works as a nurse practitioner in town. I told her what I was seeing, how the children seemed to be losing weight but somehow looked healthier than before. Their skin was paler, almost translucent, but their posture was perfect, and they moved with an energy that seemed almost supernatural. "Maybe they're just going through a growth spurt," Beth suggested. "Kids get weird sometimes when their bodies are changing rapidly. And if their grades are improving, their parents probably aren't too worried about them eating less." But I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Beth had been around children her whole career, and she knew as well as I did that healthy kids don't just stop eating and start acting like programmed robots. Something was very wrong, but none of the adults in charge seemed to want to acknowledge it. I decided to stay late at the school one day and do some investigating on my own. I told the janitor I'd left my reading glasses in the bus and needed to look for them, which gave me an excuse to be on the property after hours. The building felt different in the evening, colder, somehow, and the hallways seemed to stretch longer than they did during the day. I started in the basement, which I'd never explored before in all my years picking up these kids. There were storage rooms down there, old maintenance areas, and what looked like sections that had been sealed off years ago. But what caught my attention were the drawings taped to the walls in one of the corridors, children's artwork that definitely wasn't the type of thing you'd see displayed upstairs in the main hallways. These drawings showed dark figures, tall and thin like shadows stretched into human shapes. They showed children holding hands with these figures, following them down into what looked like tunnels or caves. The artwork was detailed in a way that seemed far too sophisticated for elementary school children, and the subject matter was disturbing enough that I couldn't understand why any teacher would have encouraged it, let alone displayed it. As I looked closer, I realized the drawings were signed by the kids on my route. Sarah's name was on several of them, along with the Miller boys, Marcus Webb, and others. But these weren't the innocent crayon scribbles that Sarah used to show me every morning. These were careful, precise illustrations that showed an understanding of perspective and shading that most adults couldn't manage. Following the corridor, deeper into the basement, I found areas that didn't match the rest of the school's architecture. The walls were older, made of rough stone, instead of modern concrete blocks. The ceiling got lower, and the air smelled of earth and something else I couldn't identify, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. I came to a heavy wooden door that looked like it belonged in a medieval castle rather than a 1972 school building. It wasn't locked, and when I pushed it open, I found a stairway leading down into darkness. The smell got stronger, and I could hear what sounded like air moving through tunnels, like the building was breathing. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was telling me to turn around and get out of there. But I kept thinking about those children, about how they'd changed, about the empty look in their eyes. If something was happening to them down there, I needed to know what it was. The stairs went down much, farther than they should have. Considering we were already in the basement of the building, I counted 37 steps before I reached the bottom, which would have put me well below ground level. The tunnel at the bottom was carved out of living rock, with smooth walls that curved overhead like we were inside a giant throat. I followed the tunnel for what felt like several minutes, using the flashlight on my phone to guide me. The tunnel branched off in different directions, and I could see that someone had been down here regularly. The floor was worn smooth, and there were modern items scattered around. School supplies, desks, even a whiteboard mounted on one of the stone walls. That's when I heard the voices. They were coming from deeper in the tunnel system, and they sounded like children singing, but not any song I recognized. The melody was strange, with notes that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should, and underneath the singing, I could hear other sounds, scraping, like something large moving across stone. I crept forward until I could see light ahead, a soft greenish glow that didn't look like it was coming from electric bulbs. The tunnel opened into a large chamber, and what I saw there made me understand why the children had changed so dramatically. There were about 15 kids down there, sitting in a perfect circle on the stone floor. They weren't the kids from my bus route. These were younger, kindergarten, and first grade age. In the center of the circle were three figures that I can still barely describe, even now. They were tall, maybe 7 feet, but so thin they looked like they were made of stretched taffy. Their skin was pale green and seemed to glow with its own light, and their faces were almost human, but with features that were just slightly wrong. Eyes too large, mouths too wide, fingers too long. The children were holding hands with these creatures, and I could see something passing between them. The kids looked like they were in a trance. Their eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, and their skin was growing paler as I watched. Meanwhile, the creatures seemed to be getting more solid, more real, like they were absorbing something vital from the children. One of the creatures turned toward me, and its eyes were completely black, like looking into deep water at night. When it smiled, I could see rows of teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for any human mouth. "Mrs. Williams," it said, and its voice came from the mouths of all the children at once, a chorus of familiar voices speaking in perfect unison. "We've been waiting for you." I ran. I don't remember climbing back up those stairs or making it through the basement corridors, but somehow I found myself back in the parking lot, gasping for air and shaking so hard I could barely get my keys into the car ignition. I drove home as fast as I dared on those dark mountain roads, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds to make sure nothing was following me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my kitchen with all the lights on, drinking coffee and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That monsters were living under the school and stealing something from children? They'd think I was having some kind of breakdown. The next morning, I almost called in sick, but I knew I had to face those kids on the bus route. I had to see if they knew that I knew. When Sarah Henderson climbed onto the bus, she looked directly at me with those dark, empty eyes and smiled. "Good morning, Mrs. Williams," she said. "Did you sleep well last night?" There was no way she could have known about my sleepless night, but something in her tone told me she knew exactly what had happened, exactly what I'd seen in the tunnels beneath the school. The ride that morning was the quietest yet. All 23 children sat in perfect silence, but I could feel them watching me in the rearview mirror. Every time I looked back, they were all staring at me with the same expression, knowing, patient, like they were waiting for me to understand something important. When we arrived at school, instead of filing off the bus in their usual orderly fashion, they all remained seated. "Mrs. Williams," Marcus Webb said from his seat behind me, "they want you to know that they're not hurting us." "Who's not hurting you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Our teachers," Sarah Henderson replied. "Our real teachers. They're showing us things, Mrs. Williams. Important things about the world that regular school can't teach us. They're helping us become better," added one of the Miller boys. "Smarter, stronger. We don't need the things we used to need anymore." I turned around to face them all, and every single child was staring at me with those dark, empty eyes. But for just a moment, I thought I saw something else there. Not emptiness, but a kind of ancient intelligence that was far too old and too vast for these young faces. "You're scared," Sarah said, tilting her head like she was studying me. "But you don't need to be scared. They want to help you too." "What are they taking from you?" I whispered. "Nothing important," Marcus replied. "Just the parts that made us weak. The parts that made us sad and angry and confused. Now we understand everything. We can see how the world really works. Your parents are worried about you," I tried. "They miss the way you used to be. They're proud of our grades," Sarah said. "They're proud of how well we behave. They don't want the old us back, Mrs. Williams. Nobody does." And the terrible thing was, she was right. Every parent, every teacher, every adult in their lives was thrilled with the changes. Higher test scores, perfect behavior, no problems at all. Who would complain about children who never fought, never misbehaved, never caused any trouble? The children filed off the bus then, moving in their synchronized patterns toward the school entrance. But Sarah Henderson lingered for a moment at the bottom of the steps. "They're going to start the new kindergarten class next week," she said, looking back at me with those ancient eyes in her 5-year-old face. 5 new children just starting to learn. "You'll bring them here every morning, Mrs. Williams. You'll help them become what we've become." That afternoon, I watched from my bus window as those new kindergartners played during their first recess. They were everything my regular riders used to be. Loud, chaotic, full of energy and life, and messy, beautiful childhood. By the end of the week, I knew they'd be sitting in perfect rows on my bus, staring straight ahead with empty, knowing eyes. I still drive Route 12. I still pick up the same children every morning and afternoon. Their test scores keep going up, their behavior remains perfect, and their parents couldn't be happier. The school district is considering making our program a model for other rural schools. Whatever we're doing here, they want to replicate it everywhere. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about what Marcus told me that morning, about how they don't need the things they used to need anymore, about how they can see how the world really works. And I wonder if maybe they're right. Maybe what they've become is better than what they were. I've never gone back down to those tunnels beneath the school. I've never tried to interfere with whatever's happening to the children, because the truth is, nobody wants me to. Not their parents, not their teachers, not the kids themselves. Everyone is happier this way. Everyone except me. I watch those new kindergartners getting quieter each week, getting more obedient, getting those same dark, empty eyes that hold too much knowledge for their young faces. And I drive them to school every morning, knowing exactly what's waiting for them in the tunnels below, knowing that I'm helping it happen. Looking back now, I think that might be the most terrifying part of the whole thing. Not the creatures in the tunnels, not the children losing their humanity. The terrifying part is how easy it was for everyone to accept it. How quickly we all became complicit in something we knew was wrong because the results were exactly what we wanted. I still live alone in my grandmother's house. I still drive the same route every day. But now I understand that some changes aren't improvements at all. They're just different kinds of loss. And sometimes the worst monsters aren't the ones hiding in the dark places under the ground. Sometimes they're the ones we invite in ourselves, because they promise to give us exactly what we think we want. I'm 28 years old, and I still can't drive past certain diners without feeling sick to my stomach. My name's Lisa Martinez, and up until last year, I was bouncing between waitressing jobs across 3 different states, never staying anywhere longer than a few months. I guess you could say I had commitment issues. with jobs, relationships, pretty much everything. But that all changed when I took a position at Ruby's Diner in Millfield, West Virginia. Millfield isn't even a dot on most maps. Population maybe 300 on a good day, nestled in a valley so deep between the mountains that you lose cell service about 5 miles before you hit the town limits. I'd found the job listing on some random employment website. They were offering decent pay, free housing, and honestly, I was broke enough that those two things alone made it worth checking out. The drive up there took me through winding mountain roads that seemed to fold in on themselves, past old coal mining operations, and homesteads that looked like they'd been abandoned for decades. When I first pulled up to Ruby's Diner, it looked exactly like what you'd picture. One of those classic 1952nd style places with red vinyl booths, checkered floors, and a long counter with swivel stools. The kind of place where the coffee's always fresh and the pie's always homemade. Ruby herself was this motherly woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a flour-dusted apron. She showed me around like I was family she hadn't seen in years. "You'll be taking over for Jenny," she told me as we walked through the small dining room. Sweet girl, but she had to move away suddenly last month. Family emergency or something. Ruby's voice had this odd quality when she mentioned Jenny. Not sad exactly, but careful, like she was choosing her words deliberately. The apartment above the diner was small but clean. 1 bedroom, tiny kitchen, living room with a couch that had seen better days. Ruby handed me the keys and told me I could start the next morning. "Most of our customers are regulars," she said. "They'll warm up to you quick enough. Mountain folk are good people once they know you." That first week, I threw myself into learning the routine. Ruby served breakfast and lunch, closed at 3 p.m. sharp. We had maybe 20 regulars who came in daily. Farmers, a few retirees, some guys who worked road maintenance for the county. Simple menu, simple people, simple life. It felt good after months of chaos in bigger cities. But something weird started happening on my 3rd day. A man I'd never seen before, heavyset guy with a gray beard, wearing overalls, came in and sat at the counter. "Morning, Jenny," he said with a smile. "The usual, honey." I looked around, thinking maybe someone else had come in behind me. "I'm sorry, I'm Lisa. Are you waiting for someone?" He looked confused. "No, sweetheart, just want my usual breakfast." "You feeling all right?" I glanced back at Ruby, who was flipping pancakes on the grill. She caught my eye and gave me this look. Not angry, but warning. Like I was doing something wrong. "What's your usual?" I asked. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, bacon crispy, black coffee. Same thing I order every morning. He said it like I was testing him on something obvious. I wrote down the order and handed it to Ruby. She didn't say anything, just started cooking. When I brought the man his food, he thanked me and left a generous tip. "See you tomorrow, Jenny." After he left, I asked Ruby about it. "That was Jim Patterson?" she said, not looking up from cleaning the grill. "He's been coming here for 15 years. Probably just takes time for folks to learn new names." But it kept happening. Customer after customer called me Jenny, despite my name tag clearly saying Lisa. When I corrected them, they looked at me like I was playing some kind of joke. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who came in for pie and coffee every afternoon, actually laughed when I told her my name was Lisa. "Oh, honey, you're such a kidder. How's your mama doing? Is she feeling better after that bout with pneumonia?" I had no idea what she was talking about. My mother lived in Arizona and hadn't been sick in years. But Mrs. Henderson kept talking about Jenny's mother like she knew her personally, asking about doctor visits and medications and family drama that had nothing to do with my life. The strangest part was how Ruby reacted to all this. Instead of correcting the customers or explaining that I was new, she would just nod along or quietly give me information I needed to play along. When Jim Patterson came in asking about my weekend plans, Ruby whispered to me that Jenny usually visited her boyfriend Mike on Sundays. When Mrs. Henderson asked about my sister's wedding, Ruby slipped me a note saying Jenny's sister got married last spring. By the end of my first week, I felt like I was living someone else's life. I started finding things in the employee locker that I was using. A spare uniform with Jenny embroidered on the pocket, personal items like chapstick and hair ties that weren't mine, When I asked Ruby about it, she just shrugged. Jenny left some things behind. You're about the same size, might as well use them. But the uniform fit me perfectly, exactly perfectly. And I'm not the same size as most people. I'm 5'2" and have a weird proportions that usually require alterations. This uniform fit like it had been tailored specifically for my body. I tried to brush it off, told myself small towns were just different, people were friendly, maybe a little too invested in each other's business. The job was easy, the pay was regular, and for the first time in months, I wasn't stressed about rent or finding my next position. I decided to stick it out. That decision turned out to be the biggest mistake of my life. The second week started, normally enough, but I began noticing things that made my skin crawl. Customers didn't just know Jenny's routine, they knew intimate details about her life that they shared with me like I was supposed to remember them. Tom from the gas station asked how I was holding up after my breakup with that guy from Charleston. Sarah, who worked at the post office, mentioned how sorry she was about my dog dying. People referenced conversations I'd never had, events I'd never experienced, relationships I'd never been in. The worst part was how natural it felt to respond. When Tom mentioned the breakup, I found myself nodding and saying, "Oh, I'm doing better." When Sarah brought up the dog, I actually felt a pang of sadness, like I was remembering something that hurt. These weren't my memories, but my body was reacting to them like they were real. I started finding more of Jenny's belongings around the apartment. A toothbrush in the bathroom that wasn't mine, clothes in the dresser that fit me perfectly, books on the nightstand with pages dog-eared and highlighted in handwriting that looked familiar but wasn't mine. A coffee mug with a chip in exactly the spot where I naturally placed my thumb. When I looked in the bathroom mirror one morning, my reflection looked wrong. Not obviously wrong, but like someone had taken my face and adjusted it slightly. My nose seemed a little straighter, my chin more pointed, my eyes a different shade of brown. I told myself it was just the lighting, just the stress of a new job in a strange place. But the changes kept happening. I found an apartment key in the uniform pocket one afternoon. It wasn't for the place above the diner. This was different, brass instead of silver, with a small charm attached. Without really knowing why, I drove to the other side of town after work and started trying the key indoors. It opened a small house on Maple Street that I'd never seen before. Inside, the house was completely furnished and lived in. Women's clothes in the closet, all in my size. Photographs on the walls showing me at town events I'd never attended, the summer festival, Christmas pageant, high school graduation. In the photos, I was laughing and hugging people I'd never met, wearing clothes I'd never owned, looking completely at home. I should have run. I should have grabbed my things and driven straight out of town that night. Instead, I found myself looking through photo albums, studying the life of this woman who looked exactly like me but wasn't me. Jenny had grown up in Millfield. She dated the same 3 guys throughout high school, worked at the diner since she was 16, lived in this house with a cat named Whiskers who was apparently hit by a car last month. The Jenny in these photos looked happy. She had friends, a community, people who cared about her. She belonged somewhere in a way I'd never belonged anywhere. I spent that night in Jenny's house, sleeping in Jenny's bed, and when I woke up, I remembered having a nightmare about my first day of school. Except it wasn't my first day of school. It was Jenny's, at Millfield Elementary in 1998. I remembered being scared because I didn't know any of the other kids, and how Mrs. Campbell, the teacher, had been so kind, and how Billy Morrison had shared his crayons with me during art time. The memory was so vivid I could smell the classroom, feel the scratchy fabric of the dress my mother had bought me, taste the peanut butter sandwich I'd eaten for lunch. But I'd never attended Millfield Elementary. I grew up in Ohio and started school in 1999, not 1998. I tried calling my parents that morning, but the number went straight to an automated message saying it was disconnected. I tried my sister, my ex-boyfriend, even my college roommate. Every single number I tried was either disconnected or answered by strangers who claimed they'd had those numbers for years. When I looked at my driver's license, my address was listed as the house on Maple Street in Millfield. My birthplace was listed as Millfield General Hospital instead of Cleveland Metro, where I was actually born. Even my birth date was different, off by 6 months. I confronted Ruby about it the next morning. "What happened to Jenny?" I demanded. The real Jenny? And what's happening to me? Ruby looked at me with this expression that was part sympathy, part resignation. Honey, you are Jenny. You've always been Jenny. You've been working here for 3 years, living in this town your whole life. I don't know what you're talking about with this Lisa business. That's impossible. I drove here from Cincinnati 2 weeks ago. I have a life outside this place. Do you, though? Ruby asked gently. Can you prove that? Can you call anyone who remembers you? I couldn't. Every piece of evidence of my existence as Lisa Martinez had been systematically erased or altered. My bank account showed direct deposits from Ruby's diner going back 3 years. My credit cards had the Millfield address on file. My car registration listed me as Jenny Parker, resident of Millfield since birth. But the most terrifying part was that I was starting to remember things that had never happened to me. I remembered my first kiss with Mike Bradley behind the school gym. I remembered the fight I'd had with my best friend Sarah over a boy in 10th grade. I remembered the day my dog Whiskers was hit by a car and how I'd cried for hours. These weren't my memories, but they felt real. More than real, they felt warm and comfortable in a way my actual memories never had. My real childhood had been lonely, moving from town to town as my father chased construction jobs. My real relationships had been brief and unsatisfying. My real life had been a series of temporary situations and half-formed connections. Jenny's life was different. Jenny belonged here. People knew her, cared about her, had watched her grow up. Jenny had roots, history, a place in the world. The transformation accelerated as October turned into November. I would wake up each morning with new memories mixed in with my old ones. I remembered learning to drive with Mr. Patterson when I turned 16. I remembered my first job at the diner, how nervous I'd been, and how Ruby had patiently taught me to balance plates and remember orders. I remembered falling in love with Mike, our first date, our fight last year that led to our breakup. And when Mike came into the diner one afternoon, tall, dark-haired, with eyes the color of old pennies, my body recognized him before my mind did. My heart sped up, my hands got sweaty. I felt a flutter of nervous excitement that I couldn't explain or control. "Hey, Jenny," he said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "Can we talk?" I found myself nodding, pouring him coffee without being asked, remembering that he took it with cream and sugar even, though I'd never served him before. We talked for an hour after the diner closed, and it felt natural, comfortable, like continuing a conversation we'd been having for years. He asked if I wanted to try again, and I said yes, without really understanding why. When he kissed me goodbye, it felt like coming home. I tried to fight what was happening to me. I wrote notes to myself about my real life, my real name, my real history, but every morning, the notes made less sense. Who was Lisa Martinez? Why would I pretend to be someone else? I'd lived in Millfield my entire life. I was Jenny Parker, and I always had been. The old memories started fading like dreams. I could remember fragments. Apartment in Cincinnati, a series of waitressing jobs, always moving, always running from something I couldn't name. But these memories felt unreal, like a movie I'd watched or a book I'd read. The Jenny memories felt solid, true, like coming home after a long time away. By Thanksgiving, I'd stopped fighting it entirely. I attended the town gathering at the community center with Mike, laughed with friends I'd known since childhood, helped Ruby serve dinner to the volunteers who cleaned up after the floods last spring. I belonged here. This was my life, my home, my family. I was Jenny Parker, 28 years old, born and raised in Millfield. I'd worked at Ruby's diner since high school, dated Mike Bradley on and off since we were 16, lived in the house on Maple Street that my grandmother left me when she died 5 years ago. I had friends, roots, a community that cared about me. The life I vaguely remembered before, moving constantly, never settling down, always looking for something I couldn't name, seemed like a nightmare I'd finally woken up from. On December 1st, a woman came into the diner, young, maybe mid-20s, with tired eyes and a backpack that had seen better days. She ordered coffee and asked Ruby if there were any jobs available. "Were you experienced?" Ruby asked, and the woman nodded. "I've been waitressing for a couple years. Looking for something steady, you know? Someplace I can settle down for a while." I watched Ruby's face carefully as she considered. We might have an opening soon. Why don't you fill out an application?" The woman's face lit up with hope and relief. As she filled out the paperwork, I noticed her hands shaking slightly from either caffeine or nerves. She reminded me of someone, though I couldn't place who. "What brings you to Millfield?" I asked, refilling her coffee cup. "Just looking for a fresh start," she said. "Someplace quiet where I can figure things out, you know?" I nodded sympathetically. Small towns are good for that. People here really look out for each other. "That sounds perfect," she said, and meant it. As I watched her finish the application, I felt a strange sense of protectiveness wash over me. This girl needed what Millfield could offer: stability, community, a place to belong. I hoped Ruby would give her a chance. "Welcome to town," I told her as she left, and she smiled like those words meant everything to her. Looking back now, I realize how natural it felt to encourage her. How right it seemed to help her find what she was looking for. Millfield has always been good at giving people what they need, even when they don't know they need it. I still work at Ruby's Diner. Mike and I got married last spring in a small ceremony at the community center, and we're talking about starting a family soon. My life here is everything I ever wanted. Stable, surrounded by people who care about me, rooted in a place that feels like home. Sometimes, late at night, I have dreams about highways and strange cities, about never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. But those dreams feel distant now, like stories someone once told me about a life that was never really mine. I'm Jenny Parker, and I've lived in Millfield my whole life. This is who I am, where I belong, and I wouldn't change it for anything. I'm 24 years old and work the night shift at Peterson's Market, the only grocery store in Deadwood, West Virginia. If you've never heard of Deadwood, I don't blame you. It's got a population of maybe 120 people on a good day, tucked away in the mountains where cell service barely reaches, and the nearest real town is 45 minutes down winding roads that ice over every winter. I ended up here after dropping out of college in Morgantown. My parents weren't thrilled about me wasting my potential, as they put it. But honestly, I needed to get away from everything and everyone for a while. My Uncle Danny had mentioned Peterson's was looking for help, and since I'd grown up spending summers in these mountains, it felt like the right place to figure out what I actually wanted to do with my life. The job itself was pretty straightforward. Stock shelves, run the register, keep the place clean. Mr. Peterson, who owned the store, was in his 70s and mostly left me alone to handle things. During the day shift, his daughter Sarah ran things. But nights were just me, and whoever wandered in needing milk, cigarettes, or beer. Most of my customers were the same familiar faces. Families who'd lived in these mountains for generations, folks who knew each other's business, and treated outsiders with polite but distant courtesy. I'd been working there about 6 months when things started getting strange, right around the beginning of November 2019. At first, I thought it was just the usual seasonal changes. Mountain communities always prepare differently for winter, stocking up on supplies, making sure they have enough food to last through potential snowstorms that could cut off the roads for days. But this November felt different. The orders people were placing weren't just big, they were specific in ways that didn't quite make sense. Mrs. Hutchins, who usually bought maybe 10 pounds of hamburger meat a month, came in asking for 40 pounds of ground beef and industrial-sized containers of salt. When I told her we'd have to special order that much, she just nodded like she'd expected it and paid cash up front. Then there was Earl Dickerson, who'd never bought anything more exotic than bacon in all the time I'd known him, suddenly requesting specific cuts of meat. Things like short ribs, bone-in chuck roasts, and organ meats that we didn't typically carry. These weren't hunting families asking for processing supplies. These were people who'd lived off the same basic groceries for years, suddenly needing equipment for serious meat preservation. The requests kept coming. Families wanted heavy-duty freezer bags, butcher paper, meat grinders, and salt by the case. People who normally pinched pennies were dropping hundreds of dollars on preservation supplies without batting an eye. What struck me most was how healthy everyone looked. These weren't wealthy folks by any means. Most families in Deadwood scraped by on disability checks, part-time work, or whatever they could make selling crafts to tourists. But despite the economic hardship that had hit the area when the last coal operation shut down, People seemed well-fed, almost robust. Kids who'd been thin and pale during the summer had filled out, and the elderly folks who usually looked frail were moving with more energy. The meat orders were the strangest part. Customers would come in asking for the November special, like it was something we regularly offered, then seem surprised when I didn't know what they meant. They'd lower their voices and ask if Peterson had talked to me about local suppliers or family arrangements. When I'd shake my head, they'd just buy whatever regular meat we had in stock and leave quickly, avoiding eye contact. I started paying closer attention to our inventory. The numbers weren't adding up right. According to our delivery records, we'd received maybe 300 pounds of various meats from our usual suppliers over the past 2 weeks. But when I did the math on what we'd sold, it was closer to 600 pounds. I figured maybe Sarah had forgotten to log some deliveries during her day shifts. But when I asked her about it, she just shrugged and said Peterson handled all the meat orders personally. That's when I started noticing the overnight deliveries. I'd come in for my shift at 10 p.m. and find fresh cuts of meat in the walk-in cooler that hadn't been there when Sarah locked up. They were wrapped in plain butcher paper, not the branded packaging from our regular suppliers, and the meat itself looked different somehow. The marbling was unusual. The color was richer, almost darker than normal beef or pork. When I asked Peterson about it the next morning, he gave me the same line about local suppliers and family arrangements that the customers had mentioned. "Don't worry about the paperwork, Tommy," he'd said, not quite meeting my eyes. "These families have been taking care of each other for generations. Sometimes the best deals aren't the kind that leave paper trails, if you know what I mean." I figured he meant under-the-table arrangements with local farmers, maybe people butchering their own livestock to save money. It wasn't unusual for mountain communities to operate outside official channels when it came to business. But something about Peterson's tone made me uncomfortable, like there was more to the story he wasn't telling me. The customers who bought this mystery meat knew exactly what they wanted. They'd point to specific cuts and nod appreciatively, like they were familiar with the quality. A few times, I heard them discussing cooking methods, long, slow braises, special seasoning techniques, ways to make the meat last through the cold months. They'd pay in cash, never asking for receipts, and hurry out like they were conducting some kind of secret transaction. Curiosity got the better of me one night when business was slow. I took a small sample of the mystery meat back to the office and cooked it up on the hot plate Peterson kept for coffee. The flavor was incredible, richer and more complex than any beef or pork I'd ever tasted, with an almost sweet undertone that made my mouth water. Whatever these local suppliers were raising, they were doing something right. But the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. I'd grown up visiting these mountains, and I knew the families around Deadwood. Most of them had small gardens and maybe a few chickens, but I couldn't recall seeing any cattle operations or pig farms substantial enough to supply this much meat. Hunting season hadn't started yet, and even if it had, deer and wild boar didn't have the marbling and fat content I was seeing in these cuts. I started paying attention to the customers' trucks when they came in. The Hutchins family drove an old Ford pickup that barely ran, but when they loaded their meat orders, I could see other wrapped packages already in the bed, like they were making rounds to multiple families. The Dickerson boys always paid with crisp bills, more cash than I'd expect from folks who'd been struggling to find work since the mines closed. Something about the whole situation felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in mid-November. I was restocking the meat section around midnight when I heard vehicles pulling up outside. Through the window, I could see several pickup trucks, their beds covered with tarps. Peterson came through the back door with his keys, which was strange because he never came to the store after hours. "Tommy, good, you're still here?" he said, but he seemed nervous, checking the parking lot before closing the door behind him. "I need you to help me move some inventory." Local delivery came in, but the driver couldn't wait until morning. I followed him to the loading dock where 4 men were, unloading packages from the trucks. I recognized them, Bill Patterson, Joe Hutchins, and 2 of the younger Dickerson boys. They nodded at me but didn't say much, working quickly to move wrapped bundles into our walk-in cooler. The packages were heavy, substantial, and despite the cold November air, I could smell the metallic scent of fresh blood. "Local butcher had a good week," Peterson explained when he saw me staring. "Folks around here, they pool resources, process their livestock together, more efficient that way." It made sense, I guess, but something about the scene felt wrong. The men were too quiet, too focused, like they were conducting serious business rather than just dropping off meat. And when Bill Patterson handed me one of the packages to carry, the shape felt wrong somehow. Too long in some places, too narrow in others. Not like any cuts I was familiar with. As I was walking the last package to the cooler, a piece of the butcher paper tore away from the bottom. What I saw underneath made my stomach drop. It looked like a hand, or at least, it looked like what a hand might look like after being butchered like livestock. I stood there in the cooler, staring at pale fingers and what might have been part of a wrist, my breath visible in the cold air as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be what I thought it was. There had to be another explanation. Maybe it was a pig's foot or some cut of meat I wasn't familiar with. People ate all kinds of unusual parts of animals. This was just my city boy ignorance showing. But deep down, I knew what I was looking at. And when I heard Peterson calling my name from the loading dock, asking if everything was okay, I realized I had to make a decision about what I was going to do with this information. I rewrapped the package carefully and put it in the cooler with the others. When I walked back outside, the men were finishing up their unloading. Peterson handed Bill Patterson an envelope. Payment, I assumed, and they shook hands like they'd just concluded any normal business transaction. "Tommy's been real helpful," Peterson said to the group, and they all looked at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Discreet, reliable, good qualities in a young man. After the trucks left, Peterson and I went back into the store. He locked the back door and turned to face me with a serious expression. "I reckon you probably have some questions," he said. "That package that tore," I started, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Let me tell you something about this community, son. These families have been living in these mountains for over 100 years. They've survived economic crashes, mine closures, floods, blizzards that cut them off from the outside world for weeks at a time. They've learned to do whatever it takes to make sure their children don't starve." He walked over to the coffee pot and poured himself a cup, taking his time before continuing. "Winters used to be harder than they are now. Sometimes the roads would be impassable for months. Supply trucks couldn't get through. Families had to make difficult choices about survival. They learned to use every resource available to them, waste nothing, and take care of their own." "Mr. Peterson?" I said, my voice shaky. "What exactly are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that sometimes travelers get lost in these mountains. Sometimes people passing through have accidents on the back roads, especially in winter weather. Sometimes those people don't make it out." The full weight of what he was saying hit me like a physical blow. I sank down onto a crate of canned goods, trying to process the implications. "You're talking about people," I said. "I'm talking about survival," Peterson replied. "I'm talking about making sure children in this community have protein to get through the winter. I'm talking about traditions that have kept families alive when the outside world forgot they existed." I thought about Mrs. Hutchins' kids, who'd gone from being pale and thin to healthy and energetic. I thought about the elderly folks who'd seemed stronger lately. I thought about the crisp bills people had been paying with, the sense of community prosperity in a place where money was usually tight. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "Long enough," Peterson said. "My daddy ran this store before me, and his daddy before him. Every November, we help the community prepare for winter. We provide what they need, ask no questions, keep no records that might cause problems. And if I don't want to be part of this?" Peterson's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his tone. "Well, son, that would be a real shame. You've been a good worker, and the community has started to accept you. Folks around here value loyalty above just about everything else." The implication was clear. I could join the community, fully, or I could become part of the November inventory myself. "What about the missing person reports?" I asked. "What about them? People go missing in mountains all the time. Accidents happen. Search and rescue does what they can, but these are dangerous areas. Sometimes folks just vanish, and there's nothing anyone can do about it." I spent the rest of my shift in a daze, mechanically stocking shelves and trying to wrap my head around what I'd learned. When daylight came and my shift ended, I drove straight home to my little rental cabin and sat on the porch, staring out at the mountains that had seemed so peaceful just hours before. Over the next few days, I started paying attention to things differently. I noticed the missing person flyers that would appear and disappear from the community bulletin board. I realized that the times I'd seen search and rescue teams in the area always seemed to coincide with the mystery meat deliveries. I understood why customers paid in cash and why Peterson kept no records of certain transactions. The worst part was that it all made a terrible kind of sense. These families had been isolated and forgotten by the outside world for generations. They'd developed their own economy, their own rules, their own methods of survival. When tourists or travelers went missing, there were investigations, but they rarely led anywhere. The mountains were vast and dangerous, full of cliffs and caves where a body might never be found. A week later, Peterson offered me a choice. I could take a larger role in the community, help coordinate the November preparations, and share in the profits that came from their unique supply chain. The money was substantial, enough to pay off my college loans and have a real future in these mountains. "Think about it, Tommy," he said. "You've seen how well the families eat. You've tasted the meat yourself. You know the quality is exceptional. These people trust you now. You could have a real place here, be part of something that's lasted for generations." The alternative, he made clear without stating it directly, was to become part of the next delivery myself. I think that's when I finally understood what had happened to the idealistic college kid who'd come to the mountains looking for purpose. I'd found it, just not in the way I'd expected. The community had needs, and I had skills they valued. I knew how to keep inventory, how to handle transactions discreetly, how to keep my mouth shut. That's how I became the primary coordinator for what we called the November program. I learned to identify suitable suppliers, lone travelers, tourists without strong connections, people whose disappearance wouldn't trigger intensive investigations. I developed systems for processing and distribution that would keep the community fed through the harsh mountain winters. If you're ever driving through the mountains of West Virginia and you see a sign for Deadwood, I'd recommend you keep driving. We're a close-knit community that takes care of our own, and we've learned that sometimes taking care of our own means making hard choices about outsiders. The store is still there, still serving the community's needs. And every November, when the first snow starts falling and the roads begin to ice over, we make sure our families have everything they need to survive until spring. It's a tradition that's kept this community alive for over a century, and I'm proud to be part of maintaining it. That college education my parents wanted me to finish, turns out I got a different kind of education up here in the mountains. I learned about survival, about community, about doing whatever it takes to protect the people you care about. And I learned that sometimes the line between civilization and savagery isn't as clear as people would like to believe. I'm still working at Peterson's Market, still helping coordinate our November preparations. The tourists who stop in seem to like my friendly demeanor and helpful attitude. I've gotten good at estimating weight and calculating yield. It's a skill that served the community well.